Picture this: a woman who once ruled England as its queen, who held the most powerful man in Europe under her spell, now kneeling on a wooden scaffold while thousands watch her final moments. Her neck is bare, her hands are trembling, and in just minutes, a razor-sharp sword will end her life with a single stroke. This isn't a scene from a movie. This is the true story of Anne Boleyn's execution on May 19th, 1512. What happened on that horrifying day in the Tower of London wasn't just the death of a queen. It was one of history's most calculated and brutal political murders, orchestrated by a king who had once promised to move heaven and earth for her love. Before we dive into the shocking details of one of history's most infamous executions, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because the truth about Anne Boleyn's final day is far more disturbing than any Hollywood movie has ever dared to show. Just 17 days earlier, Anne Boleyn had been the Queen of England, sitting beside Henry VIII at what would be her final public appearance, a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace. She watched as her husband's horse threw him violently to the ground, leaving the king unconscious for hours. When Henry finally awakened, something had fundamentally changed. The man who had defied the Pope, broken with Rome, and torn England apart to marry her was now actively planning her destruction. The speed of Anne's downfall was breathtaking and terrifying. On April 30th, 1536, she was still Queen of England. By May 2nd, she was imprisoned in the Tower of London, accused of adultery, treason, and incest. The charges were so shocking that even hardened courtiers struggled to believe them. Henry's prosecutors claimed that Anne had committed adultery with 5 different men, including her own brother George Boleyn, and had plotted the king's death. The evidence against Anne was flimsy at best, consisting mainly of circumstantial observations and forced confessions obtained through torture. Mark Smeaton, a court musician, confessed to adultery with the Queen only after being subjected to brutal interrogation techniques. The other accused men, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Francis Weston, and her brother George, maintained their innocence even under extreme pressure. What made Anne's situation even more desperate was Henry's obvious eagerness to be rid of her. The king had already fallen madly in love with Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting, and was determined to marry her as quickly as possible. Anne's failure to produce a male heir had sealed her fate. Her only surviving child was Princess Elizabeth, and Henry needed a son to secure the Tudor dynasty. The legal proceedings were a sham designed to provide a veneer of legitimacy to what was essentially a royal murder. Anne was denied proper legal representation and wasn't allowed to call witnesses in her defense. The trials were conducted with unprecedented speed, and the verdicts were predetermined. On May 15th, Anne was found guilty of murder charges and sentenced to death, either by burning at the stake or beheading at the king's pleasure. The psychological torture Anne endured during her final weeks was perhaps worse than the physical threat of execution. She was kept in the same rooms in the Tower where she had stayed before her coronation just 3 years earlier. The cruel irony wasn't lost on her. She had entered the Tower as a triumphant queen-to-be and was now trapped there as a condemned prisoner. Henry's cruelty extended to the very end. While Anne awaited her fate, the king was already making wedding preparations for his marriage to Jane Seymour. Court musicians were composing celebratory songs, and palace staff were preparing for festivities. The message was clear. Anne Boleyn was already dead to Henry VIII, and her actual execution was merely a formality. The speed and brutality of Anne's fall served as a chilling reminder to everyone at court that no one, not even a queen, was safe from Henry's wrath. Her destruction was so swift and thorough that it left even her enemies stunned by the king's ruthless efficiency in eliminating anyone who had outlived their usefulness to him. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn awoke in her tower cell, knowing she had mere hours to live. The night before, she had learned that Henry VIII had chosen beheading over burning as her method of execution, a small mercy that spared her the agonizing death by fire. But even this merciful decision carried a calculated cruelty. Instead of using the traditional English axe, Henry had imported a professional swordsman from Calais to perform the execution. Anne spent her final morning in prayer with her chaplain, receiving communion and preparing her soul for death. Witnesses reported that she seemed remarkably composed, even making dark jokes about her situation. "I heard say the executioner was very good," she told her ladies-in-waiting, "and I have a little neck." She then placed her hands around her throat and laughed, a moment of gallows humor that revealed both her courage and the psychological pressure she was under. The execution was scheduled for 9 a.m., but Henry's sadistic nature showed even in these final arrangements. The king deliberately delayed the proceedings for hours, forcing Anne to endure additional psychological torture as she waited for death. Some historians believe this delay was intentional, a final act of cruelty from a man who wanted his former wife to suffer as much as possible. Around noon, Anne was finally informed that her time had come. She was escorted from her cell by Sir William Kingston, the constable of the Tower, who had been her jailer for the past 17 days. As they walked through the Tower grounds toward the scaffold, Anne maintained her regal composure, walking with the same dignity she had displayed during her coronation procession. The scaffold had been erected on Tower Green, a private area within the Tower walls. This location was chosen deliberately. Unlike public executions at Tower Hill, this would be a relatively intimate affair with only about 1,000 witnesses, mostly court officials and foreign ambassadors. Henry wanted Anne dead, but he didn't want to create a public spectacle that might generate sympathy for her. Anne wore a simple gray damask gown with a white ermine mantle, clothing befitting her royal status even in death. Around her neck, she wore a small prayer book attached to a gold chain. Her dark hair was pinned up and covered with a white coif, leaving her neck exposed for the executioner's sword. As she climbed the scaffold steps, Anne's composure finally showed signs of cracking. Her hands trembled slightly, and witnesses noted that her face had gone pale. But she quickly regained control, standing straight and tall as she prepared to address the crowd. The woman who had once been the most powerful person in England was about to speak her final words. The executioner stood nearby, his sword hidden beneath straw, to avoid alarming the condemned woman. He was a professional from Calais, specifically chosen for his skill with a blade rather than the traditional English axe. This method was considered more humane and was typically reserved for nobility, but it also required precise timing and coordination between the victim and executioner. The stage was set for one of history's most infamous executions, and Anne Boleyn was about to face her death with a courage that would be remembered for centuries. Standing on the scaffold before a crowd of witnesses, Anne Boleyn delivered her final speech with the poise of a woman who had spent her life navigating the treacherous waters of Tudor politics. Her words were carefully chosen, following the expected formula for condemned traitors, but they carried subtle defiance that only those who knew her well could detect. "Good Christian people," Anne began, her voice clear and steady despite her circumstances. "I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that, whereof I am accused and condemned to die." The speech was a masterpiece of diplomatic language. By saying she would speak nothing against the law, Anne avoided directly admitting guilt, while also avoiding any statement that could be construed as treason. Her refusal to accuse no man was particularly pointed. Everyone knew she could have implicated Henry in her alleged crimes, but she chose to protect even the man who was murdering her. Anne continued, "But I pray God save the king, and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never, and to me he was ever a good, a gentle and sovereign lord." These words must have tasted like poison in her mouth, but they served a crucial purpose. By praising Henry's mercy and gentleness, she highlighted the irony of her situation for anyone with ears to hear. After completing her speech, Anne turned to her ladies-in-waiting, who helped her remove her headdress and necklace. This moment revealed the executioner's carefully planned deception. Throughout Anne's speech, he had been positioned behind her, out of her line of sight. Professional executioners from Calais were trained in a specific technique that required the victim to be unaware of the exact moment of execution. Anne knelt on the scaffold and began to pray, repeating, "Jesus, receive my soul," over and over. According to the planned sequence, she was supposed to place her head on a traditional execution block. However, the French executioner had a different method, one that required Anne to remain kneeling upright. At this crucial moment, the executioner employed a calculated distraction. He called out, "Where is my sword?" while an accomplice pointed in the opposite direction. As Anne instinctively turned her head to look, the executioner swiftly drew his blade from the straw where it had been hidden and struck with lightning speed. The sword stroke was clean and precise, severing Anne's head in a single blow. Witnesses reported that her lips continued to move for several seconds after decapitation, a gruesome detail that haunted observers for years afterward. The execution had taken less than a minute from the moment she knelt to pray. The crowd stood in stunned silence as Anne's head was lifted and displayed, as was traditional for executions of traitors. Blood pooled on the scaffold boards, while her ladies-in-waiting wept openly. The woman who had once been England's queen, who had inspired Henry VIII to break with Rome and reshape English religion, was now nothing more than a headless corpse. The efficient, almost clinical nature of the execution revealed Henry's desire to eliminate Anne quickly and quietly, minimizing any chance for her to become a martyr or symbol of resistance. Within minutes of Anne Boleyn's head falling to the scaffold, the most shocking act of the entire affair began to unfold. No one had prepared a coffin for the former Queen of England. In a final act of calculated humiliation, Anne's head and body were unceremoniously placed in an old arrow chest found lying around the Tower grounds. The woman who had once worn the crown of England was buried like discarded military equipment. Henry VIII's behavior in the immediate aftermath revealed the depth of his psychological detachment from the woman he had once claimed to love desperately. While Anne's blood was still being scrubbed from the scaffold, the king was already celebrating. On the very day of the execution, Henry dressed in bright yellow and went hunting, displaying a joy that shocked even his hardened courtiers. The next morning, May 20th, he was formally betrothed to Jane Seymour. The speed of Henry's marriage plans exposed the premeditated nature of Anne's execution. Within 11 days of Anne's death, Henry married Jane Seymour in a private ceremony at York Place. The king, who had once moved heaven and earth to marry Anne Boleyn, had replaced her before her body was even cold in its makeshift grave. The international reaction to Anne's execution was swift and damning. European courts were horrified by Henry's treatment of his wife, regardless of what they thought of Anne personally. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V called it a warning to all wives, while the French court expressed shock at the speed and brutality of the proceedings. Perhaps most tragically, Anne's daughter Elizabeth was declared illegitimate by Parliament shortly after her mother's execution. The 3-year-old princess, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, was suddenly stripped of her royal title and removed from the line of succession. Henry's cruelty extended even to his own child, whom he now viewed as an inconvenient reminder of his invalid marriage to Anne. The psychological impact on Henry himself became apparent in the years following Anne's death. Despite his outward celebrations, the king began showing signs of paranoia and guilt that would plague him for the rest of his life. He never spoke Anne's name again in public, and he destroyed almost every portrait and memorial of her that he could find. This systematic erasure of Anne's memory suggested a man desperately trying to convince himself that she had never existed. Historical evidence that emerged in later centuries vindicated Anne almost completely. Modern historians have found no credible evidence supporting any of the charges against her. The timing of the accusations, the forced confessions, and the predetermined nature of the trials all point to a carefully orchestrated judicial murder designed to give Henry legal cover for disposing of an unwanted wife. Anne's execution established a terrifying precedent that would haunt Henry's remaining wives. The message was clear. No woman, regardless of rank or royal protection, was safe from the king's wrath if she failed to serve his purposes. This atmosphere of fear would define the rest of Henry's reign and contribute to his growing reputation as a tyrant. The arrow chest containing Anne Boleyn's remains was eventually moved to a proper grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower grounds, where it rests today. Visitors can now pay their respects to a woman whose only real crime was failing to give Henry VIII the son he desperately wanted, a biological impossibility that cost her everything, including her life. The next time you see a romantic movie about Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, remember that their love story ended with a calculated murder disguised as justice. Anne's execution wasn't just the death of a queen. It was a preview of the tyranny that would define Henry's later years and traumatize England for decades to come. If this shocking true story left you speechless, smash that like button, subscribe for more untold secrets from history's darkest chapters, and hit that notification bell. Because the most powerful stories are often the ones that reveal how quickly love can turn to murder when power is involved. What other historical love stories do you think hide similar dark truths? Share your thoughts in the comments below.